The US dollar is the most powerful currency on earth, but behind that power lies a secret history of manipulation, panic, betrayal, and 3 moments when the entire global financial system nearly collapsed overnight. Most people think the dollar became dominant because of strength, but the real story is far darker. It's a story of wars fought not with soldiers, but with currencies. A story of nations forced into alliances they never asked for. A story of broken promises, emergency meetings, and presidents making decisions in the dead of night that reshape the world's money forever. And today, those same pressures are returning. Only this time, the cracks are much bigger and the stakes are global. This is the hidden story of how the US dollar rose to power, how it almost died 3 times, and why the next crisis may finally push it over the edge. A story of inflation, debt, trust, and how the fall of a currency can quietly take down an entire empire. This is the shocking true history of the American dollar. In the summer of 1971, Americans gathered around their television sets for what looked like an ordinary presidential address. Families were eating dinner, kids sat cross-legged on the carpet. No one expected anything unusual. But behind the scenes, the world was on the brink of a financial disaster. For months, the US Treasury had been losing gold at an alarming rate. Foreign governments, France, Switzerland, Britain, were quietly sending American dollars back to Washington and demanding gold in return. It was a silent vote of no confidence, a slow, creeping realization spreading across Europe and Asia. The United States doesn't have enough gold to back all the dollars it printed. In Washington, panic was rising. Meetings ran late into the night. Officials argued behind closed doors. Advisors whispered warnings that if something wasn't done immediately, the entire global monetary system could unravel in a matter of days. For decades, the world had trusted the dollar because it was as good as gold. But by 1971, it wasn't. America had quietly printed more dollars than it had gold to redeem. The promise that built the post-war financial order was breaking. And so, on August 15th, President Richard Nixon walked into a studio, looked into the camera, and made a decision that would change the world forever. He announced that the United States would no longer redeem dollars for gold, a decision known today as the Nixon shock, the moment global money died and something new was born in its place. But what most people don't know is this. Nixon's announcement wasn't bold leadership. It was desperation, a last-minute attempt to keep the dollar alive. And although the public thought nothing of it, the consequences were immediate. The dollar was no longer tied to anything real. No gold, no silver, just trust and nothing else. Suddenly, the US government had the power to print limitless amounts of money, and the world had no choice but to accept it. The modern financial system, the one you live under today, was built on that single night. A night when the US quietly admitted a truth it could never say out loud. The dollar almost collapsed, and we saved it by letting it float. But this was only the first time the dollar nearly died. And the decisions made that night would set the stage for a far greater crisis, one that would hit 3 decades later during the meltdown of 2008. And by then, the cracks in the system were no longer hidden. After Nixon's shock announcement, the world expected the US dollar to stumble. Instead, it exploded in power. The United States began pushing the dollar anywhere it could, to banks, to governments, to corporations around the world. And those dollars, once backed by gold, were now backed by something far more flexible: trust. Just like Rudy pitching shoes to every sports club in Germany, American diplomats pitched the dollar to every nation willing to listen. Trade deals, alliances, military support, all of it quietly tied to one condition: use our currency. And the world did. Countries stocked their reserves with US dollars. Oil nations priced every barrel of crude in dollars. Corporations borrowed dollars to fund their global expansions. The US had transformed its currency into a product, one that every nation needed to buy. By the mid-1970s, the dollar was everywhere. And just like the Dassler Brothers factory upgrade, this global demand gave America something it desperately needed: room to print. Without gold holding it back, Washington discovered a new superpower. Whenever the economy faltered, whenever a crisis threatened stability, the US could simply create more dollars. It was a genie in a bottle, a magic trick, a financial cheat code, And like every cheat code in history, it came with consequences no one wanted to face. But just as the Adidas brothers reached their breakthrough moment at the Olympics, the dollar reached its own global showcase. Its Olympic Games came in 1973. That year, tensions in the Middle East exploded into war. Oil-producing nations were furious at Western involvement, and in response, they delivered a blow that shook the world: an oil embargo. Prices didn't just rise, they exploded, quadrupling in months. Cars lined up for hours just to buy a few gallons of gas, factories slowed or shut down, inflation surged, people feared the system would break, and then, in the middle of this chaos, the United States struck a secret world-changing deal, one that would cement the dollar's dominance for the next half-century. In a quiet series of meetings in 1974, US officials met with Saudi ministers and proposed a simple arrangement. Price all your oil in US dollars and we'll protect your kingdom. Saudi Arabia agreed. Other nations followed. And just like Jesse Owens wearing Dazzler shoes on the world stage, every country buying oil, every factory, every airline, every government, was now, indirectly, wearing the shoes of America's currency. The US had created the petrodollar, a system where global energy, the lifeblood of civilization, flowed exclusively through the American dollar. It was the marketing triumph of the century, a financial masterstroke, a moment that made the dollar unstoppable. Orders for dollars came from every corner of the planet. Central banks hoarded them. Trade networks revolved around them. The dollar became the oxygen of global commerce. On the surface, everything looked perfect for the United States. But beneath the celebration, beneath the surging demand, something else was brewing. Just like the growing tension between the Dazzler brothers after their Olympic success, the foundations of the dollar system were beginning to strain. Nations resented America's new financial power. Inflation was rising at home. Debt was quietly creeping upward. And the belief that the dollar was untouchable was slowly, silently turning into arrogance. The deal that saved the dollar in the 1970s also planted the seeds of a crisis that would erupt 3 decades later, because unlimited money always comes with an expiration date, and in 2008, the bill finally came due. By the early 2000s, the US dollar looked unstoppable. It powered global trade, controlled oil markets, and sat at the center of every major financial institution. On the surface, the system had never been stronger, but beneath that confidence, the cracks were already forming. Banks were taking risks they didn't understand. Consumers were borrowing money they couldn't repay. And Wall Street had created a new class of financial weapons, complex, dangerous instruments disguised as innovation. Just like the growing tension between Rudy and Addie inside the Dazzler factory, America's own financial machine was becoming divided from within. The people who created the products didn't understand them. The people who sold them didn't care, and the people who depended on the system had no idea what was about to happen. As the US economy grew more chaotic, one thing became clear: the dollar was being pulled in two opposite directions. The Federal Reserve wanted stability, Wall Street wanted profit, and both sides believed the other was jeopardizing the system. The stress only grew after the attacks of 9/11. With fear gripping the nation and the economy on the edge of recession, the Federal Reserve slashed interest rates to historic lows. Cheap money flooded the system. Banks handed out loans to anyone who asked. Mortgage companies approved borrowers without income, jobs, or assets. Home prices skyrocketed, and the entire world believed the US housing market could never fall. Just like the Dazzler brothers producing boots and weapons during wartime, America's financial institutions were manufacturing something dangerous, but pretending it was safe. Inside the banks, tensions ran high. Some analysts warned that the debt was spiraling out of control. Others dismissed the risks and accused them of holding back profits. Executives argued, departments blamed one another, the financial house was getting bigger, but its foundation was getting weaker. And just like Rudy and Addie living under the same roof, the US government and the financial sector were trapped in a fragile, toxic partnership. Both sides depended on each other. Both sides distrusted each other, and both feared that the other would be the first to break. In 2007, it happened. The mortgage market began to collapse. Banks started reporting losses, investors panicked, and the Federal Reserve rushed in to stabilize the system. But instead of admitting the truth, major banks downplayed their exposure. They hid losses, they reassured investors, they insisted everything was fine, they weren't telling the truth. Behind the scenes, some executives were quietly preparing escape plans. Others were dumping failing assets onto foreign investors. Some even blamed government regulators or rival institutions. Everyone was pointing fingers, and no one was taking responsibility. Just like Rudy reporting Adi to the Nazi authorities, America's financial players began betraying each other to survive. When Lehman Brothers finally collapsed, it wasn't a surprise, it was a result of years of hidden resentment, shortcuts, paranoia, and greed. Lehman executives blamed the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve blamed Congress. Congress blamed the banks blamed each other. And the world watched in disbelief as the US financial system, the backbone of the global dollar, began to fall apart from the inside. In desperate meetings that stretched through the night, US officials begged banks to cooperate. Bank CEOs accused one another of treachery. The Treasury Department pleaded for unity, but every major institution was focused on one thing: self-preservation. The betrayals became public. Leaders were exposed, secrets leaked. The trust that held the dollar together was dissolving. The American financial empire wasn't collapsing from foreign attack. It was collapsing because its own institutions could no longer stand each other. And when the dust finally settled, the world had learned a terrifying truth. The dollar didn't survive because it was strong. It survived because the US government printed $700 billion in a single emergency rescue, and later, trillions more. Just like the Dassler brothers' partnership shattered beyond repair, the relationship between trust and the dollar had been broken. The system was saved, but only temporarily, because the amount of money printed in 2008 didn't solve the crisis. It created a much bigger one, a crisis that would reappear in 2020. But this time, the scale wasn't in billions, it was in trillions. And the betrayal was no longer between institutions. It was between governments, currencies, and entire nations. After the 2008 crisis, the United States faced a choice. It could reform the financial system, or it could double down on the power of the dollar. It chose the second option. Washington began printing trillions of dollars to stabilize the economy. And just like Adi naming his company Adidas and Rudy creating Puma, the world suddenly found itself choosing sides, dollar or not dollar. But this split wasn't symbolic. It reshaped entire nations. You see, after 2008, countries had to decide which financial team they were joining. Some nations, like Japan, South Korea, and most of Europe, stuck closely to the US dollar system. Their central banks held massive reserves of dollars. Their financial institutions depended on access to US markets. Their economies were tied to American interest rates. They were the Adidas side of the river. But other nations, Russia, China, Iran, and later India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, began drifting toward an alternative. They questioned America's decisions. They worried about future sanctions. They resented the power the US held over the global system. They began forming their own alliances, trading in their own currencies, building new financial pipes. These were the Puma side of the river. And just like the town that split into two communities overnight, the global economy began to fracture. But the consequences weren't just political, they were deeply cultural. In Europe and the West, using the dollar became a mark of stability, a symbol of safety, trust, influence. Governments that held dollars were seen as aligned with the global mainstream. Meanwhile, in parts of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, using dollars became a symbol of dependence. A reminder that one nation had the power to freeze their reserves, collapse their banks, or cut them off from global trade. These nations felt exposed, vulnerable, they wanted independence, and so two economic worlds emerged, two identities, two financial cultures separated not by rivers, but by ideology. Just like the town of bent necks, where people would look down at your shoes to decide whether to talk to you or not, countries began looking at your currency choices before deciding whether to trust you. If a nation traded oil in dollars, it signaled loyalty to the US-led system. If it traded oil in yuan or rupees or rubles, it signaled rebellion. And suddenly, global diplomacy looked less like alliances and more like rival shoe gangs. Entire regions began dividing themselves. Dollar users on one side, dollar challengers on the other. The IMF, World Bank, and Wall Street sat firmly on the dollar side. BRICS, regional development banks, and new cross-border payment systems grew on the other. The world was becoming a financial town of bent necks, everyone glancing down, checking what currency shoes each nation wore, before deciding whether to deal with them. But just like Adidas and Puma shoes eventually looked different, the world's financial systems began to diverge. The dollar side relied on confidence, liquidity, and America's unmatched financial depth. The challenger side relied on nationalism, resource power, and the desire to break free from US influence. Two worlds, two futures, two financial identities developing in parallel. And just like in Germany in the 1940s, a massive opportunity and a massive conflict UN was approaching, because global power was no longer based only on armies or technology. It was based on currency, and the world was preparing for a competition that would determine the future of money. The question was no longer whether the dollar was strong, but whether it could survive a rival. The world was still reeling from the 2008 financial crisis when the next shock arrived, a global pandemic that brought entire economies to a halt. Airports were empty, stores were closed, oil futures briefly fell below zero, unemployment skyrocketed, factories shut down overnight. The global economy was falling apart in real time, and the US dollar, the core of that system, seemed to be in trouble again. But just like West Germany entering the World Cup with low expectations, the US was about to stage a comeback no one saw coming. Nations expected the dollar to weaken. Analysts predicted a collapse in confidence. Some even believed a new currency, the yuan, the euro, or even cryptocurrencies, would finally challenge American dominance. But then something unexpected happened. The US government and the Federal Reserve unveiled something unprecedented: a financial adjustable cleat, a tool that gave the dollar stability when every other currency was slipping. America unleashed a flood of emergency measures: massive stimulus packages, unlimited quantitative easing, and fast liquidity pipelines for every major financial institution. At first, it looked reckless. Printing trillions in weeks, sending checks to millions of people, injecting money into every corner of the economy. Other nations hesitated. Some refused to act. Others lacked the capacity. But the US had a unique advantage. The same way Adidas's adjustable studs gave West Germany the perfect grip on a wet field. America's ability to print the world's reserve currency gave the dollar leverage no other nation possessed. As global markets sank deeper into crisis, countries everywhere began rushing toward the dollar. The US Treasury market became the world's safe haven. Demand surged, and the dollar strengthened. It didn't just survive the downturn, it dominated it. While smaller nations struggled to maintain control of their financial systems, America's emergency measures allowed its currency to stay firm, liquid, and widely trusted. Just like West Germany's shocking comeback in the rain-soaked final, the dollar staged its own miracle. Global investors returned, stock markets rebounded, and the world's most powerful currency walked off the field stronger than ever. For Americans, it was a source of renewed confidence. For much of the West, it was proof that the US dollar was still the king. But for other nations watching closely, particularly China, Russia, and members of the rising BRICS bloc, this miracle was infuriating. They realized something uncomfortable. As long as the world needed dollars, the US could survive any crisis, even one it created. And so, these nations began planning their own counterattack. Rumors spread that Russia and China were working on new payment systems to bypass the dollar. Whispers of gold-backed trade networks began circulating. Countries started experimenting with bilateral deals in local currencies. And just like the accusations that Adidas bribed customs officers to block Puma shoes, suspicions of sabotage and manipulation grew. Whenever a nation tried to move away from the dollar, it faced sudden economic pressure, sanctions, or market turmoil. Coincidence? Sabotage? Strategic retaliation? No one knew for sure, but the mistrust was growing. With the global economy fracturing, the rivalry between the dollar and its challengers intensified. China expanded its Belt and Road Initiative. BRICS nations accelerated plans for a shared currency. The Middle East began questioning whether oil should still be priced in dollars. The competition had escalated far beyond economics. It had become a battle of influence, identity, and global prestige. And just like the Dazzler brothers preparing for the next generation of their feud, the world's financial powers were ready to bring in new players. China and India ramped up their central bank operations. Saudi Arabia began exploring non-dollar oil sales. Brazil and South Africa partnered on new trade systems. And Russia accelerated its push for de-dollarization. A new generation of currency heirs was stepping onto the field, each with its own agenda, its own ambitions, and its own reasons to challenge the dollar's throne. The miracle had bought the US time, but it also awakened every major rival. And now, The world wasn't just split into two sides of a river, it was preparing for something much bigger, a global currency war.